Her fuel situation was becoming critical, not because of excessive consumption during combat maneuvering, but because her mission profile had always assumed that extraction would be more difficult than penetration. The mathematics of her situation were becoming clear. She had enough fuel to reach friendly airspace, but only if she could exit the defensive zone without further combat maneuvering. Each surface-to-air missile engagement required evasive action that consumed fuel at rates that shortened her range and reduced her options for reaching Edwards Air Force Base or alternative landing sites. But the defensive systems below were designed to create exactly this dilemma, forcing aircraft into fuel-critical situations where pilots would be compelled to make predictable decisions about flight paths and landing sites. Her opponents understood American tactical doctrine well enough to anticipate her likely responses to fuel emergencies and had positioned assets accordingly to exploit the predictability that came with desperation. Reyes realized that her survival depended on making decisions that enemy planners hadn't anticipated, choices that appeared illogical from conventional perspectives, but made sense when survival became more important than following established procedures. Her experience with classified operations had taught her that sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to play by rules that were designed to ensure defeat. Climbing above the mountain peaks that had provided cover during her reconnaissance, she deliberately exposed herself to defensive systems that immediately achieved radar lock and began engagement sequences. But instead of taking evasive action, she maintained course and altitude while activating electronic countermeasures that had never been tested in actual combat conditions. Her aircraft's modified defensive systems created electromagnetic signatures that confused targeting radars and caused surface-to-air missiles to lose lock during their terminal guidance phases. The technique was dangerous because it required maintaining predictable flight paths during missile engagements, but it also conserved fuel while creating confusion among defensive operators who couldn't understand why their weapons were missing targets that should have been easily destroyable. The tactic worked long enough for her to clear the primary defensive zone, but also revealed capabilities that would change how enemy forces planned future defensive operations. Her modified F-16 represented technology that existed outside normal Air Force inventory, and her survival techniques demonstrated training that wasn't part of conventional pilot education programs. Breaking radio silence for the first time since beginning her reconnaissance mission, Reyes transmitted a brief position report that confirmed her extraction from hostile airspace. The transmission was encoded using protocols that required special clearances to decode, but it provided enough information for Edwards Air Force Base to begin calculating her probable arrival time and fuel status. Control Ghost, package delivered heading home. Request priority handling for debrief materials. Staff Sergeant Kumar's voice carried relief that was unprofessional but understandable. Ghost, Control, copy your transmission. You're cleared direct Edwards, priority handling approved. Weather remains clear, runway 27 available for your arrival. Ink was still fresh when Sergeant Martinez first saw it. A small, intricate design just below Captain Evelyn Ghost Reyes' left wrist, barely visible beneath her flight suit sleeve. To most, it looked like geometric patterns, angular lines intersecting in seemingly random formations. Martinez had been about to bark the standard regulation about visible tattoos when something made him pause. The lines weren't random at all. His weathered face went pale as recognition dawned. Those weren't decorative patterns. They were coordinates. Latitude and longitude marks that corresponded to a location he knew all too well, a place that officially didn't exist on any map, where shadows moved between mountains and good people disappeared without explanation. The tattoo contained a grid reference that had been classified beyond top secret for over a decade. "Cover that up," he had started to say, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he found himself staring at this slight woman with tired eyes and steady hands, wondering how she possessed knowledge that could get them both killed just for acknowledging it existed. Captain Reyes caught his stare and pulled her sleeve down with practiced efficiency. Her expression remained neutral, but Martinez noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. She knew that he knew. The question hanging in the desert air between them was what he planned to do about it. Edwards Air Force Base shimmered under the Nevada sun, its runways stretching like black ribbons toward distant mountains. F-16 Fighting Falcons sat in neat rows, their gray surfaces drinking in the heat while maintenance crews worked with methodical precision. But Martinez's attention wasn't on the aircraft or the bustling activity of the base. It was fixed on the woman standing before him, clipboard in hand, waiting for his decision. She had arrived 3 days ago with transfer orders that raised more questions than they answered. Her service record was a masterpiece of bureaucratic vagueness, years of classified missions redacted into black rectangles, commendations with no explanations, and a call sign that nobody would explain. Ghost seemed appropriate for someone whose past was more absence than presence. The other pilots had already started their whispered assessments. Too small for a fighter pilot, they said. Too quiet. Too different. They saw her compact frame and assumed weakness, missed the way she moved with the controlled economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion could mean death. They noticed her reluctance to join their after-hours gatherings, but failed to understand that some people carried solitude not as weakness, but as armor. Now, as Martinez studied that tattoo's coordinates burning in his memory, he realized he was looking at someone whose silence wasn't mysterious. It was necessary. The question was whether that necessity extended to eliminating witnesses who had seen too much. 3 hours later, the base's routine was shattered by an emergency klaxon that sent maintenance crews scrambling and pilots sprinting toward the ready room. The briefing was classified beyond anything most of them had ever encountered, a situation developing along the Pakistani border that required immediate response. Intelligence was sparse, details were compartmentalized, and the mission profile was unlike anything in their training manuals. Captain Reyes sat in the back row of the briefing room, her presence drawing sideways glances from the other pilots. Major Thompson, the squadron commander, stood before a wall-mounted screen displaying satellite imagery of mountainous terrain. Red circles marked suspected enemy positions, while blue triangles indicated friendly forces in various stages of retreat. "Gentlemen," Thompson began, then caught himself with visible irritation. "Pilots, we have a developing situation that requires immediate air support. Reconnaissance assets have gone dark, ground units are taking heavy casualties, and the extraction window is closing rapidly." Lieutenant Collins, fresh from flight school with enthusiasm that hadn't yet been tempered by reality, raised his hand. "Sir, what about the terrain? Those mountains look like they'd create significant radar shadows and communication dead zones." Thompson's expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "That's correct, Lieutenant. This mission will require pilots capable of operating in degraded conditions with minimal support." His gaze swept the room, lingering momentarily on Reyes before moving on. "Navigation will be primarily visual, communication windows will be limited, and the margin for error is essentially non-existent." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken doubts. These were good pilots, but most of their experience involved clear skis, reliable instruments, and backup systems that worked when needed. The mission Thompson was describing sounded less like a routine support operation and more like a one-way ticket into a nightmare. "Sir," another pilot ventured, "what's the threat assessment? Are we looking at surface-to-air missiles, fighter intercepts, or just small arms fire?" Thompson's smile contained no warmth. "Yes." The single word hung in the air like a death sentence. "All of the above, plus terrain that's claimed more aircraft than enemy action. The mountains don't care about your training scores or your confidence level." Captain Reyes remained motionless throughout the briefing, her expression giving nothing away. But Martinez, watching from the doorway, noticed something the others missed. Her fingers weren't fidgeting or drumming nervously like the rest. Instead, they moved in small, precise patterns against her knee, the same angular motions from her tattoo, repeated like a silent mantra or a prayer to gods who specialized in impossible missions and narrow escapes. The mission assignments were distributed with military efficiency that masked underlying chaos. Callahan and Morrison would take the northern approach, using their F-16C Block 50s to establish air superiority while ground units attempted extraction. Peters and Davidson were assigned close air support for the southern corridor, their aircraft loaded with precision-guided munitions and cluster bombs. Then Thompson paused, consulting his tablet with the expression of someone delivering news he didn't particularly believe himself. "Captain Reyes, you'll be flying solo reconnaissance along the eastern ridge. Your mission is to gather intelligence on enemy positions and provide real-time updates to ground commanders." The room erupted in barely contained murmurs. Solo missions in contested airspace were dangerous enough under ideal conditions. Sending a pilot alone into mountains filled with surface-to-air missiles and unpredictable weather patterns bordered on suicide. Lieutenant Collins looked ready to voice an objection, but something in Thompson's expression warned against it. "Sir," Captain Morrison finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral, "wouldn't it be more appropriate to assign a two-ship formation for reconnaissance? The eastern ridge is known for communication blackouts and extreme weather conditions." Thompson's response came too quickly, as if rehearsed. Captain Reyes specifically requested solo assignment. Her experience with specialized reconnaissance makes her uniquely qualified for this particular mission profile. The phrase specialized reconnaissance hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Everyone could smell it, but nobody wanted to acknowledge what was burning. Reyes herself remained silent, accepting the assignment with the same composure she'd shown since arriving at Edwards. But Martinez caught something in her eyes when Thompson mentioned the eastern ridge. Not fear, recognition. After the briefing dispersed, Martinez found himself walking alongside Reyes toward the aircraft maintenance hangars. The Nevada sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him uncomfortably of tracer rounds and burning aircraft. "That tattoo," he said quietly, matching her measured pace. "I served in Afghanistan, third tour embedded with special operations, spent time in places that don't appear on maps." Reyes didn't slow or acknowledge his words, but Martinez noticed her left hand unconsciously move to cover her wrist. "Those coordinates," he continued, "they mark a valley where good people went in and never came out, where helicopters fell out of clear skies and mountains swallowed entire units without explanation." She stopped then, turning to face him with eyes that had seen too much and survived anyway. "Some places leave marks, Sergeant. Some marks are reminders, and some reminders are the only things that keep you alive when everything else fails." The hangar where her aircraft waited was different from the others. While the standard F-16s underwent routine maintenance checks, Reyes's fighter sat isolated in the far corner, surrounded by technicians with security clearances that exceeded their pay grades. The aircraft itself looked identical to the others at first glance. The same sleek profile, the same gray paint scheme, the same lethal elegance of a weapon designed for speed and precision. But Martinez's trained eye caught the differences. The electronic warfare pod mounted beneath the fuselage was unlike anything in the standard Air Force inventory. The heads-up display visible through the canopy showed readouts that shouldn't exist on conventional aircraft. Most telling were the maintenance logs, aircraft numbers that didn't match any official registry, flight hours that added up to impossibility, and service records that were classified at levels he'd never encountered. Chief Master Sergeant Williams approached with the measured pace of someone who'd seen too many good pilots climb into aircraft and fail to return. His weathered hands held a clipboard thick with pre-flight checklists and authorization forms that bore stamps from agencies most people had never heard of. "Captain, your bird's ready," Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of professional respect reserved for pilots who'd proven themselves in circumstances that couldn't be discussed in polite company. "All systems checked and verified. We've loaded the reconnaissance package you requested, plus some additional equipment that isn't officially part of your mission profile." Reyes nodded, accepting the clipboard with steady hands. Martinez watched her review the forms with the thoroughness of someone who understood that overlooked details had a tendency to become fatal oversights. Her signature was precise, economical, the kind of handwriting that suggested years of filling out reports that would never see daylight. "Chief Williams," she said quietly, "if communications go dark for more than 6 hours, follow standard protocol. No search and rescue, no questions, no exceptions." Williams's expression didn't change, but Martinez caught the slight tightening around his eyes. This wasn't the first time he'd received such instructions, and experience had taught him that pilots who spoke of communication blackouts weren't being pessimistic, they were being realistic. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the tarmac as other pilots began their pre-flight preparations. Callahan and Morrison moved with the confident efficiency of aviators who'd trained together for years, their pre-flight banter carrying the easy camaraderie of shared experience. Peters and Davidson checked their weapons loads with methodical precision, their conversation focused on target priorities and engagement protocols. But Reyes conducted her pre-flight inspection alone, moving around her aircraft with the solitary focus of someone whose survival had always depended on trusting no one but herself. Her hands traced control surfaces and weapon mounts with the familiarity of long practice, checking details that weren't part of any standard checklist, but had kept her alive when standard procedures failed. Martinez found himself wondering about the missions that had shaped her into this solitary professional, the operations that had taught her to expect betrayal and prepare for abandonment, the experiences that had convinced her that survival was a personal responsibility that couldn't be delegated to teammates or backup systems. The radio crackled to life across the base's communication system as control tower personnel began coordinating the evening's operations. Weather reports indicated clear skies over the target area, but Martinez had learned to distrust meteorological optimism when it came to mountain flying. Clear skies had a way of becoming deadly obstacles when terrain and politics combined to create situations that existed outside normal parameters. "Ghost, this is Control." The tower operator's voice carried the professional calm that controllers used to mask their own concerns about missions they weren't cleared to understand. "You're cleared for taxi to runway 27. Departure time is your discretion once all aircraft are airborne." Reyes acknowledged with a brief transmission that revealed nothing about her emotional state or mission expectations. But Martinez noticed how she paused before climbing into her cockpit, her gaze sweeping across the base with the intensity of someone memorizing details that might never be seen again. The other pilots were already strapping themselves into their aircraft, their conversations shifting from casual banter to professional focus as systems came online and displays illuminated with the green glow of electronic readiness. Radio checks confirmed communication links, while navigation systems synchronized with satellites that orbited in precise patterns, designed to ensure that American pilots never fought alone or unobserved. But as Reyes settled into her cockpit and began her startup sequence, Martinez realized that her mission existed outside those reassuring networks of support and observation. The eastern ridge where she was heading represented a gap in coverage, a blank space where satellites lost contact and radio signals died in valleys that swallowed electronic transmissions like hungry animals. Her engine spooled up with the distinctive whine of a Pratt & Whitney F100 turbofan, the sound building from whisper to roar as fuel and air combined in controlled explosions that would carry her into situations where controlled was the last thing anyone expected. The heads-up display in her cockpit came alive with symbols and readouts that told the story of an aircraft ready for war. But Martinez wondered if any amount of readiness could prepare someone for the kind of mission that required tattoos instead of mission briefs. As she taxied toward the runway, following behind the two-ship formations that would provide conventional air support, Martinez felt the familiar weight of knowing too much and being able to do too little. He'd seen good people disappear into classified operations before, their names eventually appearing on memorial walls with dates but no explanations, their families receiving folded flags and carefully worded letters that revealed nothing about how their loved ones had actually died. The difference this time was that Reyes seemed to understand the mathematics of her situation with the same clarity that Martinez did. She wasn't a victim being fed into a machine designed to consume optimism and courage. She was a professional who'd made peace with probabilities that would terrify most people, someone who'd learned to find comfort in the spaces between hope and despair, where competence became the only religion that mattered. Her aircraft reached the runway threshold and turned into position, afterburners painting the evening sky with blue flame as she waited for final clearance to depart. Ghost Control, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds light and variable, visibility unlimited. Good hunting. The F-16 began its takeoff roll with the explosive acceleration that never failed to impress observers, even those who'd witnessed thousands of similar departures. But this takeoff felt different to Martinez, less like a routine military operation, and more like watching someone step through a doorway that might not have a return path. The aircraft rotated and climbed into the Nevada sky, its navigation lights blinking in the gathering dusk as it headed toward mountains that held secrets older than the men who'd drawn their current borders. Lieutenant Collins stood beside Martinez on the observation deck, watching the aircraft disappear into distance that swallowed sound and reduced even the most sophisticated fighter to a memory. "Sergeant, is it normal for pilots to fly reconnaissance missions alone? I mean, she's heading into some of the most dangerous airspace in the region." Martinez considered several responses, settling on one that contained enough truth to satisfy curiosity without revealing enough to get anyone killed. Some missions require specific qualifications. Lieutenant, Captain Reyes has experience with operations that most of us aren't cleared to discuss. The younger man nodded as if he understood, but Martinez could see the doubt in his expression. Collins was still young enough to believe that military operations followed logical patterns, that dangerous missions were assigned based on transparent criteria, and that good pilots were supported by systems designed to bring them home safely. Experience would eventually teach him that the military's most important work often happened in the spaces between official procedures, where success depended on individuals who'd learned to operate outside the safety nets that protected conventional operations. As full darkness settled over Edwards Air Force Base, Martinez made his way to the communications center, where duty officers monitored radio frequencies that connected American forces across multiple time zones and conflict areas. The evening's operations were unfolding according to schedule. Callahan and Morrison had reached their patrol area and were maintaining contact with ground controllers, while Peters and Davidson were coordinating with forward air controllers for close support missions. But the frequency assigned to Captain Reyes remained silent, not the silence of technical difficulties or communication blackouts, but the deliberate quiet of someone operating in circumstances where radio transmissions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Martinez had heard that silence before, in places where good people did necessary work that couldn't be acknowledged or explained. Staff Sergeant Kumar, the senior duty officer, noticed Martinez's interest in the communication logs. "Sir, Captain Reyes' mission profile indicates extended radio silence is expected. Her last position report showed her on course and on schedule, but were not expecting further contact until mission completion. The phrase mission completion carried implications that Kumar probably didn't fully understand. In conventional operations, mission completion meant returning to base with intelligence gathered and objectives achieved. But some missions were designed with different definitions of completion, where success might require sacrifices that couldn't be discussed in post-mission debriefings. Martinez settled into a chair near the communication console, accepting that his role in the evening's events had become that of witness rather than participant. 200 miles east of Edwards, Captain Reyes guided her F-16 through mountain passes that hadn't appeared on any charts she'd studied during mission planning. The terrain below resembled a moonscape carved by geological forces that had no respect for human navigation systems or political boundaries. Peaks rose like broken teeth against star-filled sky, their shapes creating radar shadows where aircraft could disappear from electronic observation as completely as if they'd never existed. Her heads-up display showed position indicators that placed her exactly where she needed to be, but Reyes knew better than to trust electronic systems completely when operating in terrain that specialized in making sophisticated technology useless. Instead, she relied on visual navigation techniques that predated GPS satellites and computer-assisted flight systems, techniques learned in places where backup systems had a tendency to fail when needed most. The radio remained silent not because of equipment malfunction, but because certain operations required communication discipline that extended beyond normal tactical considerations. She was flying through airspace where unauthorized transmissions could trigger responses from defensive systems that officially didn't exist, operated by forces that weren't supposed to be present in regions that weren't supposed to be contested. Her mission briefing had been deliberately vague about specific objectives, but Reyes understood the real purpose of her flight. Intelligence assets had gone dark in a pattern that suggested either catastrophic equipment failure or hostile action designed to blind American observation capabilities. Ground units were taking casualties from weapons that shouldn't have been present in the region, and reconnaissance satellites were providing images that raised more questions than they answered. The eastern ridge where she was heading represented a gap in surveillance coverage that had been deliberately created by someone who understood American intelligence capabilities well enough to exploit their weaknesses. Her job was to determine whether that gap concealed natural defensive positions or something more deliberate, something that required the kind of close-range observation that only a skilled pilot could provide while surviving the experience. As she approached the target area, Reyes began detecting electronic emissions that shouldn't have been present in terrain, supposedly occupied only by scattered tribal groups and occasional smuggling operations. The emissions suggested sophisticated radar systems and communication networks that required power sources and technical expertise far beyond what intelligence assessments had predicted. Her aircraft's defensive systems began registering threat indicators that painted a complex picture of overlapping coverage zones, designed to create a nearly impenetrable electronic fence around whatever was hidden in the valleys below. Surface-to-air missile sites provided direct engagement capability, while electronic warfare systems were positioned to disrupt navigation and communication systems of any aircraft that attempted to penetrate the defensive perimeter. The tactical situation was becoming clear. She was approaching a military installation that existed outside official knowledge, defended by forces that weren't supposed to be present, using equipment that wasn't supposed to exist. The kind of situation that required pilots with experience in operations that couldn't be acknowledged or explained, where survival depended on skills that weren't taught in conventional flight training programs. Reyes felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that accompanied recognition of immediate danger, but also the cold clarity that came with understanding exactly what needed to be done. Her training had prepared her for situations where standard procedures were inadequate, where success required improvisation based on experience that couldn't be shared in official reports. The defensive systems below were sophisticated enough to track her aircraft despite her attempts at terrain masking, but not quite advanced enough to achieve target lock through the electronic countermeasures her modified F-16 carried. She was flying in the narrow margin between detection and destruction, using skills that had been developed through missions that officially never happened in places that didn't appear on maps. Her reconnaissance sensors began gathering intelligence that would reshape American understanding of the regional threat environment. The installation below wasn't a terrorist training camp or weapons smuggling operation. It was a forward operating base, equipped with military hardware that suggested state-level support and strategic objectives that extended far beyond local insurgency activities. Banking sharply to avoid a surface-to-air missile launch that painted bright lines across the darkness below, Reyes felt the G-forces that reminded her why fighter pilots needed to maintain physical conditioning that bordered on obsessive. The missile's proximity fusing activated close enough to rattle her aircraft's airframe, but not close enough to achieve the catastrophic damage its designers had intended. She was now flying in active combat conditions, engaged with defensive systems that were designed to destroy aircraft exactly like hers, operated by people who understood American tactical doctrine well enough to anticipate her likely responses to their attacks. The situation had moved beyond reconnaissance and into the realm of survival, where her primary mission objective became gathering enough intelligence to justify the risks she was taking, while ensuring that intelligence reached commanders who could act on it. Her aircraft's data links remained active despite the electronic warfare environment, automatically uploading reconnaissance imagery and threat analysis to satellite systems that would relay the information to Edwards Air Force Base and other locations, where people made decisions about American foreign policy based on intelligence gathered by pilots who flew alone into situations that could start wars or prevent them. The pattern of defensive positions below suggested that she discovered something that enemy forces had invested significant resources in protecting. The installation represented either a major intelligence breakthrough or a strategic deception designed to draw American reconnaissance assets into carefully prepared killing zones. Either way, her discovery was important enough to justify the mission's security classification and the deliberate isolation that had characterized her assignment. Climbing to avoid another surface-to-air missile engagement, Reyes found herself above the defensive umbrella but still within range of long-range systems that were designed to engage high-altitude targets. Her position was becoming untenable. She'd gathered the intelligence her mission required, but extracting from the area was proving more difficult than penetration had been. The electronic warfare systems below were now operating in full defensive mode, creating electromagnetic interference that was beginning to affect her aircraft's navigation and communication systems. She was experiencing the kind of technological degradation that forced pilots to rely on basic flying skills and fundamental navigation techniques that were often overlooked in training programs focused on sophisticated electronic systems. Her heads-up display flickered with intermittent warnings as defensive systems below attempted to achieve target lock despite her countermeasures. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Reyes recognized the signs of a trap designed to force her into predictable flight patterns where more accurate weapons could achieve the kill that missile systems had failed to accomplish. Experience had taught her that survival in such situations required decisions that appeared counterintuitive to conventional tactical doctrine. Instead of climbing to escape the threat envelope, Reyes dove toward the terrain, using mountain peaks and valley systems to break radar lock while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid controlled flight into terrain. The technique required precision that left no margin for error, but also created unpredictable flight paths that made targeting solutions nearly impossible for ground-based defensive systems. Her aircraft's terrain-following radar painted a three-dimensional picture of the landscape below, allowing her to navigate through passes that were barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan, while maintaining speeds that would be suicidal under normal circumstances. The experience was like threading a needle while riding a motorcycle through a thunderstorm, requiring absolute trust in instruments that could fail and reactions that had to be faster than conscious thought. Behind her, surface-to-air missiles impacted mountainsides in brilliant explosions that illuminated valleys with brief flashes of orange light. The defensive systems were firing at shadows and radar returns, wasting expensive ordnance on targets that existed only in their electronic imagination. But Reyes knew that her advantage was temporary. Eventually, the operators below would recognize her tactics and adjust their engagement parameters accordingly. She was flying through terrain that had claimed aircraft for decades, where atmospheric conditions and geological formations combined to create navigation hazards that challenged even the most sophisticated flight systems. Radar altimeters provided conflicting readings as her aircraft bounced between valley floors and ridge lines, while her navigation systems struggled to maintain accurate position fixes in an environment where GPS signals were unreliable and inertial systems accumulated errors that could prove fatal. The tattoo on her wrist seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat as she recognized landmarks that matched coordinates burned into her memory. This was the place where good people had disappeared, where helicopters had fallen from clear skies, where entire units had vanished without explanation. But now she understood what had made this terrain so lethal. It wasn't natural hazards or equipment failures that had claimed those lives, but sophisticated defensive systems operated by forces that existed outside official recognition. Her reconnaissance mission had revealed the truth behind casualties that had been attributed to training accidents and mechanical failures. The installation below represented a threat that had been systematically eliminating American intelligence assets, while maintaining plausible deniability for losses that couldn't be explained without revealing classified operations. Banking through a canyon that was narrow enough to brush her wingtips against rock walls, Reyes began transmitting compressed data bursts that would upload her reconnaissance findings to satellite systems despite the electronic warfare environment. The transmission technique required precise timing and positioning to ensure that her signal could penetrate the interference while remaining brief enough to avoid detection by direction-finding equipment. Each data burst contained intelligence that would reshape American understanding of regional threats, but also confirmed what she'd suspected since accepting the mission. She'd been sent to gather information that couldn't be obtained through conventional reconnaissance methods, in terrain where survival depended on skills that few pilots possessed. The electronic systems around her aircraft began showing signs of degradation as defensive jamming intensified, forcing her to rely increasingly on visual navigation and basic flight instruments that functioned independently of sophisticated electronic systems. She was transitioning from modern warfare to something that resembled aerial combat from earlier eras, where pilot skill mattered more than technological superiority. Her fuel situation was becoming critical, not because of excessive consumption during combat maneuvering, but because her mission profile had always assumed that extraction would be more difficult than penetration.